25.
The time is just gone 22 minutes past 4 p.m. We continue with Palestine. We continue with Al-Quds. We continue with Masjid al-Aqsa. And this afternoon, we joined by Jerusalem-based anti-occupation activist Sahar Vardi. Sahar, assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Yes, wonderful having you with us. Now, obviously, we've seen the events of the last few days, but also I think this has started from the beginning of the holy month of Ramadan, where Palestinians obviously have known only violence, particularly looking at Jerusalem. And the events of the last few days obviously have made the situation even much worse.
So as you say, I mean, it's been a whole process throughout the Ramadan, but I think it's actually important to give it a larger context, not just through the Ramadan. A lot of the protests happening right now are specifically in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah and around the evictions there. And this is a protest movement that is 13 years old. And really, there've been protests there since 2008. And it's finally kind of accumulating. So obviously, the police violence that we're seeing now has been much more during Ramadan and is what we should focus on, but I think it's important to say this is a part of a larger protest movement.
Well, certainly, but also at the same time, you know, when one looks at the month of Ramadan and everybody knows, the entire world knows about the spirituality of the month, the sacredness of this month, but it does appear in recent years that violence has become a permanent feature for the Palestinians in the month of Ramadan.
It definitely is the case, and I think like many things, occupation has a tendency to kind of erupt or be even more violent, especially in these times. We've seen it definitely with the decision to put checkpoints and close the steps of Damascus Gate in the month of Ramadan, which is obviously an extremely problematic thing to do, which really started all of this energy that is coming. And we've seen that in previous years as well. I will just add that there is also a calendar issue in the last few years that has come up again and again, which is that Ramadan is happening at the same time as the day of the occupation of Jerusalem, in which there is a big settler celebration like we see today. And in the last 3 years, we've seen these two things come together because of the calendars. And that's always also created a huge amount of violence from the Israeli side, from the occupation forces, knowing that there are a lot of Muslims obviously praying in the Old City around this time, and also the settler march when they come together. We see the consequences of this. Maybe a bit of good news. This year is the first year that because of these protests and the Palestinian resistance to this has been rather wide, the march through the Muslim quarter, the settler march through the Muslim quarter has been canceled this year for the first time in over a decade.
Well, obviously, that's you know some good news, you know, that that has been cancelled. But also, I think at the end of the day, when one looks at the sequence of events and how these things have evolved over a period of time, as you mentioned, as far as the calendar is concerned, Jerusalem Day and the like, and we knew that this was likely to happen. But also in terms of the sequence of events, and you know, particularly looking at the settlers who tend to basically start everything off. You know, when one looks at the court and the court rulings with regard to what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah in terms of the Palestinian homes that obviously were lost. So there seems to be a coordinated plan, you know, building up to this. And this is, you know, ultimately culminating in the type of violence that we see. We see hundreds of people obviously being beaten up, being injured. And then we see the desecration of the holy site of Al-Aqsa as well.
Yeah, and I think your point, I mean, the cooperation between the settler movement and the government is definitely extremely at play here. And I think not just in Jerusalem, right? It just last Saturday, as an example, there was a settler attack in the South Hebron Hills, dozens of settlers throwing stones at Palestinians, and the army just standing next to them, walking them, throwing tear gas in the same direction. And so what we see in Jerusalem with this cooperation between the settler movement and the police, the fact that a member of Knesset of Israel moved his chambers to Sheikh Jarrah, a right-wing member of Knesset, so this combination of right-wing settlers together with the occupation forces of the police is true throughout the West Bank. And I think in recent years, we're really seeing an increase of that. We're seeing an increase of settlers setting out the agenda of the government. Before it still happened before. It's not a new phenomena, but I think now it's really in our face. We're really seeing it, and people are less ashamed of it, which is something very much to be aware of and scared of.
Yes. Now, sir, obviously, when one looks at this policy in Jerusalem and the likely impact it's going to have in even in Gaza or even in the West Bank, I'm sure that there are going to be consequences.
Yeah, I mean, there've been already protests both in Gaza and the West Bank in response to this in the last few weeks. The entire area is kind of very much on high alert, and you can see the reaction there. It also means that the army is very proactive. There's been a lot of violence in the West Bank, much more than usual by the army as well. More checkpoints, more things of the sort. So there's a lot of awareness to it, and I think we haven't yet seen the peak of it. It'll be very interesting to see both what happens today when there's a feeling of a little bit of a victory in Jerusalem, which we'll see how will play out, but also during the weekend, this in Eid and what happens after Ramadan. I think that's a lot of the big question. Will this momentum of protest and this momentum of us hearing about what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and other places in Palestine, will this continue after Ramadan? And I think that's really something that's also up to us, the responsibility to say, even if it's not right now during Ramadan and these clashes, we still need to keep these issues up and talking about them.
But also, sir, I think what is of concern is possibly are we going to see an escalation of a military offensive after Ramadan?
Well, I'm definitely hoping not. I will say that with Israel not having a government, it will be a little bit harder than it usually would be for many Israeli politicians, and isn't completely in the political interest of any politicians. On the other hand, not having a government also allows things like what's happening today, which is the police doing whatever they feel like. And if the army starts doing that as well, we might see that. I think at this point, from all directions, there isn't really a push for a military offensive, but it's hard to say what will happen. And I hope that we stay only with kind of, I mean, obviously, I hope this stops as well, but I hope it doesn't escalate in that direction. I wouldn't say that it looks right now like it's going into a military offensive more than the usual quote unquote occupation.
Yes, and I think an issue that one needs to bear in mind is the political dynamics that are playing out both in Israel and also in Palestine, because we've seen the postponement of the Palestinian election. So again, we are talking about a problem from a leadership perspective, a leadership vacuum as a result of the postponement of the elections. But also on the other side, we've seen Israel election after election, and at the end of the day, they can't come to form a government. So in the absence of any political solutions, it appears as if this is now become a free for all for everyone involved, particularly when one looks at the settlers and the actions of the Israeli police, of late.
Yeah, and I think that that's what's scary about it. That now, in this absence of policy, what we're seeing is that the police is just following orders of settlers, and the army is just following orders of settlers on the ground, from the ground level. And that's really because there is no government. We get to see this cooperation on the ground level, which is extremely scary.
Yes. Now, just looking from an activism perspective and your side, being an activist, and obviously we've seen activists right across the entire world. We've seen the reaction now coming through in South Africa. In fact, early on, I just did an interview where there's a lot of encouragement for people to get involved, protests right across the country. Israeli trades the parliament in South Africa just to raise that awareness. And I'm sure we are going to see a lot of that taking place across the world. And just looking at it from your side, in terms of activism and the type of activism that is needed across the world to highlight this problem and to give it a lot more a sense of urgency in terms of the world waking up to the reality.
So I think what's needed is really being out on the streets. I think there's a tendency, especially now with COVID, a lot of activism has moved online to petitions and things like that. And it's important to say that's not enough. The pictures coming in of actual protesters on the streets in different countries around outside of embassies or trying to convince parliaments to talk about this are much more effective and I think are really important. And again, I want to state that while now they're happening this week, we need to really keep that for the next 2 weeks. The court hearing around Sheikh Jarrah that was postponed from today because of this pressure is scheduled for 2 weeks from now. And so that pressure has to continue. Obviously, here on the ground, it will continue. There are continued protests, and activists are in solidarity, and activists who are here can be in solidarity directly with Palestinians. But those who are overseas, really, it is about also pushing your parliament to speak about it. I will also say there are other things. I mean, looking at the companies like the tear gas companies that are used here and protesting them, there's a lot of connections you can make to your own local context and understand what are the right pressure points to protest, but really also to be out on the streets and not just online.
Well, certainly, and also the likes of BDS across the world as well, as you mentioned, in terms of targeting certain companies. Because I think what we are also seeing is we're seeing civil society obviously waking up, and they have always been at the forefront of the struggle for justice and to end the oppression in Palestine. But very little that we see coming through by way of governments, and I'm sure we can still expect governments to sit back and do absolutely nothing while the carnage takes place, while the brutality goes on. And it's left to people like yourselves and ourselves, civil society, to take up this fight.
For sure. And I think it's, as you say, it depends on where you are. Like in South Africa, you have more of a chance to be able to get some kind of parliamentary response. Then that's a good pressure point. In the US, you obviously don't. So looking for the tear gas company that can be pressured is much more useful, or whatever other form of companies. But I think it is really important in the context of BDS right now, as things are happening to the ground, to make sure you also connect BDS campaigns to what is happening. So if you're having a campaign currently about a specific company, understand also what their relationship is with what's happening right now, so you can make it relevant and really speak to the people, because this is the reality on the ground.
Well, sir, we must thank you very much for your time with us this afternoon here on Salam Media. All the best to you, and please stay safe. And hope we can touch base at some stage to get some regular updates on from your side, and just looking at it from an activist perspective. All the best to you.
Inshallah soon. Thank you for having me.
Sahar Vardi joining us this afternoon, and just providing an update in terms of what the latest situation is. The time is headed for 4:35. We come back. It's the time of the day where we bring you a tribute to our Muslim broadcasters and journalists, season 2 this afternoon. We're talking with Zakia Ahmad Siddiqui, presenter and producer at Lotus FM, and that will take place at around 4:45. We've got some ads to play out, and it's also the Asar Adhan. So don't go away. Stay with us.